The conference room at Fort Bragg smelled like stale coffee and old carpet. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hayes sat perfectly still at the long wooden table, her hands folded in front of her, her posture military straight despite the dull ache in her left knee. The injury was old now, 3 years since the explosion that had ended her field career, but it still reminded her of its presence on cold mornings like this one. Across from her sat 5 men in various military uniforms, their chests decorated with medals and ribbons that told stories of their own. They were reviewing her application to join the elite tactical training program at the base. It was a coveted position, one that would allow her to pass on her knowledge to the next generation of soldiers. After 22 years of service, most of it spent in places she still couldn't talk about, Sarah thought she had more than earned the right to be considered. "Mrs. Hayes," began Colonel Dickerson, a broad-shouldered man with graying temples and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He deliberately used the wrong title, though her rank was clearly displayed on the paperwork in front of him. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," she corrected quietly but firmly. He waved his hand dismissively. Right, look, I'm sure you understand our position here. This training program is extremely demanding. Physical demands, mental stress, long hours in challenging conditions." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "We need instructors who can keep up with our young recruits. No offense, but at your age and with your history, we're concerned about your ability to meet those demands." Sarah's jaw tightened, but her expression remained neutral. "Sir, I spent 15 years in special operations. I've trained soldiers in 3 different theaters of combat. My injury doesn't limit my ability to instruct, and my age brings experience that can't be bought or taught." Major Brennan, a younger man with sharp features and sharper eyes, snorted softly. "Special operations," he repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Ma'am, I've reviewed your file. Most of it's redacted. For all we know, you spent your career pushing papers in some classified office somewhere." "My record speaks for itself," Sarah said evenly, though heat was beginning to rise in her chest. "Does it?" Lieutenant Colonel Morrison chimed in. He was the oldest of the group, his face lined with deep wrinkles. "Because what we see here is a female officer who spent most of her career in positions that conveniently can't be verified. Then you took a medical discharge after an injury. Now you want to come back and train our best and brightest." He shook his head slowly. "I just don't see it." Sarah took a slow breath through her nose. She had faced enemy fire, survived an ambush that killed half her team, and pulled 3 wounded soldiers through 2 miles of hostile territory with a fractured leg. She had earned every scar on her body and every commendation in her file. But sitting in this room, facing the dismissive stares of men who had never served alongside her, she felt a different kind of helplessness. "Gentlemen," she said, keeping her voice level, "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the same consideration you'd give any qualified candidate. My medical evaluations show I'm fit for duty. My training record is exemplary, and my years of field experience—" "Field experience we can't verify," Dickerson interrupted. "Look, Mrs. Hayes, we appreciate your service, we really do, but this position requires someone who can command respect from these young soldiers, someone they can look up to, someone who represents the pinnacle of military excellence." He spread his hands as if explaining something simple to a child. "You have to understand how it looks. A woman of a certain age with an injury asking to train our elite forces. These boys need role models who embody strength and capability." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt it settle over her, heavy and suffocating. They weren't questioning her qualifications. They were questioning her right to be there at all. "I see," she said quietly. "I'm sure you could find a nice position in administration," Major Brennan offered, his tone falsely sympathetic. "Maybe helping with recruitment events, community outreach, that sort of thing. Something more suited to your current capabilities." Sarah stood slowly, gathering the folder she had brought with her. Inside were letters of recommendation from generals and admirals, commendations from foreign governments, and training certifications that most soldiers never even had the opportunity to attempt. None of it mattered to these men. "Thank you for your time, gentlemen," she said. As she turned to leave, she heard Morrison mutter to Brennan, just loud enough for her to catch. "Probably spent her whole career riding a desk and flirting her way up the ranks." The other men chuckled. Sarah's hand tightened on the door handle, her knuckles going white. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to demand they look at her real service record, to make them understand who they were dismissing. But she had learned long ago that some battles couldn't be won with words. She walked out of the conference room with her head high and her shoulders back, even as anger and humiliation burned in her chest. The hallway of the administrative building was quiet. Her footsteps echoed on the polished floor as she made her way toward the exit. She had parked in the visitor's lot, a small indignity that had stung when she arrived. She had spent 2 decades on this base, had run these same hallways during training, had said goodbye to friends in these same buildings before they shipped out and never came home. Now she was a visitor. Sarah pushed through the heavy door and stepped out into the crisp November air. The sky was gray and heavy with the promise of rain. She took a moment to compose herself, breathing in the cold air and letting it clear her head. "Colonel Hayes." She turned to find a young captain jogging toward her, his uniform crisp and his expression earnest. He couldn't have been more than 30, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. "Can I help you, Captain?" Sarah asked. "I'm Captain Rodriguez, ma'am. I work in personnel." He glanced back at the building, then lowered his voice. "I processed your application. I just wanted to say, I've seen a lot of files, ma'am, and yours is impressive. Even with the redactions, the commendations and evaluations tell a clear story. I think they're making a mistake." Something in Sarah's chest loosened slightly. "I appreciate that, Captain." "For what it's worth," he continued, "there are people on this base who remember. The old-timers in special operations, they talk sometimes. They mention names with respect. I've heard yours come up." Sarah studied the young officer's face. "You should be careful about saying things like that, Captain. It might not be good for your career." Rodriguez straightened his shoulders. "With respect, ma'am, I joined the military to serve alongside the best. I think it's a damn shame when politics gets in the way of that." He hesitated, then added, "There's a retirement ceremony next week. General Hawthorne is stepping down. A lot of the old guard will be there. You might consider attending." "I wasn't invited," Sarah said. "It's open to all base personnel and veterans," Rodriguez replied with a small smile. "I'm pretty sure you qualify, ma'am." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a text from her daughter, Emily, reminding her about dinner that evening. Sarah had almost forgotten. Emily was home from college for the week, and Sarah had promised they'd have a proper meal together. "Thank you, Captain," Sarah said, tucking her phone away. "I'll think about it." Rodriguez nodded and headed back into the building. Sarah walked to her car, a practical sedan that had replaced the truck she used to drive. Everything about her life now felt like a replacement for what she'd had before. A replacement career, a replacement purpose, a replacement identity. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine. The rejection stung, but it was the dismissiveness that cut deeper. She had given everything to her country, to her service. She had missed her daughter's childhood, her father's funeral, countless birthdays and holidays. She had sacrificed her body, her relationships, her peace of mind. And to those men in that conference room, she was just a woman past her prime, trying to claim credit for things they assumed she couldn't have done. Sarah started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. As she drove through the base, past the training fields where young soldiers ran drills, past the memorial wall with names of the fallen etched in stone, she felt the weight of her own name. Sarah Hayes, Lieutenant Colonel, retired. A title that had once meant everything, now reduced to a formality that men like Dickerson couldn't even be bothered to use correctly. But there was another name, one that only a handful of people in the world knew. A name that had been whispered in the dark places where wars were fought in silence. A name that had meant something once, before the injury, before the retirement, before she became just another aging veteran looking for relevance. Winter Siren. Sarah hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 3 years. She wasn't sure she'd ever hear it again. The operations she'd been part of were buried under layers of classification. The people she'd saved would never know her name. The enemies she'd eliminated had died without ever seeing her face. That was the nature of the work, silent, invisible, erased. The week passed slowly. Sarah threw herself into the mundane tasks of civilian life, trying to shake off the sting of rejection. She helped Emily with a research paper, went to the grocery store, did yard work that didn't really need doing. Her daughter noticed the tension but was kind enough not to push. Emily had grown up as a military kid. She knew when her mother needed space. On Thursday evening, Sarah sat in her small home office, staring at the framed photos on the wall. There was one of her in dress uniform at her promotion ceremony, her face younger and full of fire. Another showed her with her old team, faces blurred out for security reasons, taken somewhere in the mountains of a country she still couldn't name. In the photo, she was smiling, her arm around a teammate who had died 2 months later in a helicopter crash. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The number was unfamiliar. "Hayes," she answered, her voice automatically taking on the crisp tone of her military days. "Colonel Hayes, this is Brigadier General Martin Carver." Sarah sat up straighter, her mind racing. Carver was a legend in special operations circles, though most of his work was as classified as her own had been. She had never met him personally, but she knew of him. "General Carver, how can I help you, sir?" "I heard about what happened with your training instructor application," Carver said without preamble. "I wanted to reach out personally. What happened in that room was unacceptable, and I apologize on behalf of the professional military." Sarah's throat tightened. "I appreciate that, sir. I'm calling because I want you to know that your service hasn't been forgotten by everyone. There are still people who understand the value of what you contributed." He paused. "I'm also calling to ask if you'll be attending General Hawthorne's retirement ceremony." "I wasn't planning on it, sir." "I think you should reconsider. General Hawthorne specifically asked me to make sure you received an invitation. He remembers your work, Colonel. He remembers it well." Sarah felt a flutter of something in her chest, hope maybe or curiosity. "I'll be there, sir." "Good, and Colonel, wear your dress uniform, all of it." The ceremony was held in the base's main auditorium on Saturday afternoon. Sarah arrived early, her dress uniform pressed to perfection, her medals arranged precisely on her chest. She had hesitated over some of them, the classified commendations that raised questions she couldn't answer, but General Carver's words echoed in her mind. All of it. The auditorium was already filling with officers, enlisted personnel, and veterans. Sarah found a seat toward the middle, trying to remain inconspicuous. She recognized some faces from her active duty days, though most were strangers. The military was always changing, always bringing in new blood while the old guard faded away. She spotted Colonel Dickerson near the front, laughing with his cronies from the review board. Major Brennan was there too, looking smug and self-satisfied. Sarah felt her jaw clench but forced herself to relax. She wasn't here for them. The ceremony began with the usual formalities. The color guard presented the flags, everyone stood for the national anthem, and then General Hawthorne took the stage. He was a tall man in his late 60s, his hair completely white but his posture still military straight. His chest was covered in ribbons and medals that spoke of a long and distinguished career. "Thank you all for being here today," Hawthorne began, his voice carrying easily through the auditorium. 43 years ago, I raised my right hand and swore an oath to defend this country. Today, I'm stepping down from active duty, but that oath remains. Once a soldier, always a soldier. The audience applauded. Sarah found herself moved by the general's words, by the emotion in his voice. She knew what it felt like to dedicate your entire life to service, and she knew how hard it was to step away. Hawthorne spoke for several minutes about his career, about the changes he'd seen in the military, about the men and women he'd served alongside. Then his tone shifted, becoming more serious. In my years of service, I've learned that true heroism often goes unrecognized. The nature of our work, particularly in special operations, means that some of the bravest among us will never receive public acknowledgement. Their deeds are classified, their sacrifices known only to a few. He paused, his eyes scanning the audience. But I've also learned that silence doesn't diminish valor. And while we can't always tell the whole story, we can honor those who served in the shadows. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Something in the general's tone had changed. There's someone in this audience today, Hawthorne continued, who represents the very best of what our military can be. Someone who served with distinction in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Someone who saved countless lives and asked for nothing in return except the honor of serving. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah's hands gripped the armrests of her seat. This individual was recently denied a position at our tactical training program, Hawthorne said, his voice hardening. The review board determined that this highly decorated officer wasn't suitable to train our soldiers. I want to share with you why I believe that decision was not just wrong, but shameful. Colonel Dickerson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sarah could see the back of his neck turning red. The officer I'm speaking of has 3 silver stars, Hawthorne said, his voice ringing out clearly. 2 bronze stars with valor, a Purple Heart, multiple commendations from NATO allies, and a classified service record that, if it could be made public, would stand among the most impressive in modern military history. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This officer led rescue operations that saved 43 American and Allied personnel from hostile territory. This officer developed tactical innovations that are still being used by our special operations forces today. This officer was wounded in the line of duty after refusing to evacuate until every member of their team was secured. Hawthorne's voice dropped, becoming even more intense. And this officer was told, just last week, that they weren't qualified to train our soldiers because of their age and gender. Gasps echoed through the auditorium. Sarah felt her face flush hot. She wanted to sink into her seat, but she forced herself to remain still, her eyes fixed on the general. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hayes, Hawthorne said, turning to look directly at her. Would you please stand? For a moment, Sarah couldn't move. Every eye in the auditorium had turned to find her. Then slowly, she rose to her feet, her hands at her sides, her chin up. The applause started immediately, building like a wave. People began to stand, a rippling effect that spread through the entire auditorium until everyone was on their feet, clapping. Sarah saw tears in the eyes of some of the older veterans. She saw young soldiers staring at her with newfound respect. She also saw Colonel Dickerson's face, pale and stricken. Colonel Hayes served under the operational call sign Winter Siren, Hawthorne continued when the applause finally died down. A name that struck fear into our enemies and hope into our allies. I had the privilege of working with Colonel Hayes on multiple operations. I've seen her courage firsthand. I've seen her brilliance. And I've seen her bleed for this country. He paused, letting his words sink in. The men who reviewed her application saw none of this. They saw a woman of a certain age with an injury. They made assumptions based on prejudice rather than facts. They failed to recognize excellence because it didn't come in the package they expected. His voice grew cold. That failure reflects poorly on them. Not on Colonel Hayes. Sarah remained standing, her emotions a whirlwind. Pride, vindication, embarrassment, gratitude, all of it swirling together until she couldn't separate one feeling from another. I'm announcing today that I'm establishing a new advanced tactical program, Hawthorne declared. It will be run independently with oversight from Joint Special Operations Command, and I'm personally requesting that Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hayes serve as the program director. More applause, even louder this time. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes but refused to let them fall. Not here, not now. When the ceremony finally ended, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Officers she'd never met shook her hand and thanked her for her service. Young soldiers asked for advice. Veterans shared their own stories of being underestimated and overlooked. Through it all, she saw Colonel Dickerson and his colleagues slip out a side exit, their faces dark with humiliation. Captain Rodriguez appeared at her elbow, grinning widely. "Congratulations, ma'am. That was incredible." "Thank you, Captain," Sarah managed, still somewhat overwhelmed. "Colonel Hayes." She turned to find General Carver approaching, another officer beside him. The second man was tall and lean, with sharp blue eyes and the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in the field. He wore the insignia of a SEAL commander. "Colonel Hayes, I'd like you to meet Captain James Sullivan," Carver said. "He's the SEAL team commander who will be working with your new tactical program." Sullivan extended his hand and Sarah shook it firmly. His grip was strong, his eyes assessing but respectful. "It's an honor, ma'am," Sullivan said. "I've heard stories about Winter Siren for years. Never thought I'd get to meet the legend in person." "The legend is exaggerated," Sarah said automatically. Sullivan smiled. "I doubt that. I saw the after-action reports from Operation Frost Hammer, the classified ones. What you did in those mountains." He shook his head. "That wasn't exaggerated, that was extraordinary." The following Monday, Sarah returned to Fort Bragg with a very different purpose. She had been given a temporary office in the Special Operations Building while the new tactical program was being established. It was a small space, but it was hers, and it had a window overlooking the training grounds. She spent the morning reviewing curriculum proposals and personnel files. General Hawthorne had given her significant autonomy in building the program, and she was determined to create something meaningful. Something that would train the next generation, not just in tactics and weapons, but in the kind of thinking that had kept her alive through 15 years of dangerous operations. Around noon, there was a knock on her door. "Come in," Sarah called. The door opened to reveal Colonel Dickerson. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past few days. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by something that might have been shame. "Colonel Hayes," he said stiffly, "do you have a moment?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Of course, please sit down." Dickerson sat, his hands clasped in his lap. For a long moment he didn't speak. "I owe you an apology," he finally said. "What I said in that review meeting, the assumptions I made, they were wrong, completely wrong. I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I failed to see the qualified officer sitting in front of me." Sarah waited. She had learned long ago that some people apologized because they were sorry, and some apologized because they'd been caught. She wanted to know which category Dickerson fell into. "I've been in the military for 28 years, Dickerson continued. "I thought I knew what excellence looked like, but the truth is I'd become comfortable with a certain, narrow view. I didn't want to acknowledge that my assumptions might be outdated." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "General Hawthorne called me into his office Friday afternoon. He didn't mince words about my performance. Neither did General Carver." "I see," Sarah said neutrally. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Dickerson said. I wanted you to know that I understand the gravity of my mistake, and I wanted to ask if there's anything I can do to make amends." Sarah considered this. She could have enjoyed his discomfort more, could have made him squirm, but she'd never been petty and she wasn't about to start now. "You can help me with the new program," she said. You have experience in training operations, and despite what happened, I believe you're competent at your job. I could use that competence if you're willing to check your biases at the door." Dickerson looked surprised. "You want me to work with you, after what I said?" "I don't hold grudges, Colonel. They're a waste of energy." Sarah leaned forward. "But I do demand professionalism and respect. If you can provide those things, then yes, I'd welcome your experience on the team." "I can provide those things," Dickerson said quickly. "I will provide those things, you have my word." "Then we have an understanding." Sarah extended her hand, and after a moment Dickerson shook it. After he left, Sarah sat alone in her office, a small smile on her face. The past week had been a roller coaster of emotions, from the depths of humiliation to this unexpected vindication. But it wasn't the recognition that mattered most to her. It was the opportunity to continue serving, to pass on what she'd learned to those who came after. Over the next several weeks, the tactical training program took shape. Sarah worked 18-hour days, designing courses, interviewing instructors, and developing training scenarios. Captain Sullivan proved to be an excellent partner, his SEAL experience complementing her own special operations background. They recruited instructors from across the military branches, deliberately seeking out people with diverse experiences and perspectives. Sarah made it clear that the program would be open to anyone who met the standards, regardless of age, gender, or background. Excellence was excellence, no matter what package it came in. The first class of students arrived in January. 24 men and women, hand-picked from various units, all eager to learn and prove themselves. On the first day, Sarah stood in front of them in the main classroom, feeling the familiar rush of purpose that had been missing since her retirement. "Welcome to the Advanced Tactical Leadership Program," she began. "Over the next 6 months, you're going to be challenged physically, mentally, and emotionally. You're going to learn tactics and strategies that most soldiers never encounter. You're going to be pushed to your limits and beyond." The students sat at attention, their eyes fixed on her. "Some of you may be wondering about my qualifications to run this program," Sarah continued. "You may have heard that I spent most of my career in classified operations. You may have questions about what I actually did." She paused. "I'm not going to answer those questions, not because I'm hiding anything, but because the work speaks for itself in the results you'll see. What I will tell you is this: I've been where you want to go. I've done things I can't talk about, with people whose names I can't mention, in places that don't officially exist. And I've learned things that I'm going to share with you." She began to pace slowly in front of the classroom. "But more than tactics or techniques, I'm going to teach you about leadership. Real leadership, not the kind you get from a textbook. The kind that keeps your team alive when everything goes wrong. The kind that earns respect through action, not through rank." Sarah stopped and faced them directly. "And I'm going to teach you that excellence has no gender, no age limit, no demographic profile. It's about dedication, skill, and the willingness to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself." A female lieutenant in the front row sat up a little straighter, her eyes shining with determination. Sarah recognized that look. It was the same one she'd seen in her own mirror decades ago. The training was brutal. Sarah didn't believe in coddling her students, but she also didn't believe in pointless harassment. Every challenge had a purpose, every hardship a lesson. She ran them through scenarios based on real operations, teaching them to think 3 steps ahead, to adapt when plans fell apart, to lead when chaos reigned. And slowly, word began to spread about the program. Officers who had dismissed Sarah before started to take notice. The students under her instruction were performing exceptionally well. Her tactical innovations were being adopted by units across the special operations community. One evening in March, Sarah was working late in her office when General Carver stopped by. "Burning the midnight oil, Colonel?" he asked from the doorway. Sarah looked up from the stack of evaluation reports she'd been reviewing. "Just finishing up some paperwork, sir. What brings you by?" Carver entered the office and closed the door behind him. "I wanted to check in, see how you're doing. This has been quite a transition." "It has," Sarah agreed, "but it feels right, like this is what I was meant to be doing." "The feedback on your program has been outstanding," Carver said. "Joint Special Operations Command is already talking about expanding it. There's discussion of making it mandatory for all field-grade officers in special operations." Sarah felt a surge of pride. "That would be incredible, sir." "You've proven a lot of people wrong, Colonel Hayes, including some who should have known better." Carver smiled slightly. "I heard Colonel Dickerson has become one of your strongest advocates." "He's doing good work," Sarah said diplomatically. "People can change when given the opportunity." "That's generous of you," Carver paused. "There's something else I wanted to discuss. We have a situation developing overseas. I can't give you details yet, but there's a rescue operation being planned. Hostages, hostile territory, very tight timeline. The planning team specifically requested your input." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was the work she knew, the work she'd thought was behind her. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, 600, classified briefing room." "I'll be there, sir." After Carver left, Sarah sat in the quiet office, looking out at the darkened training grounds. Somewhere out there, people were in danger. Somewhere out there, soldiers were preparing to risk their lives to bring them home. And she was being asked to help, not despite her experience, but because of it. The next morning, Sarah entered the briefing room to find a dozen officers gathered around a large table covered with maps and satellite imagery. She recognized most of them, veterans of various special operations units. They nodded respectfully as she took her seat. For the next 4 hours, she worked with the team, analyzing the intelligence, identifying risks, proposing solutions. Her mind moved through the problem with the same clarity it always had, finding angles others missed, seeing connections that weren't immediately obvious. When the briefing ended, the mission commander, a Marine colonel named Peterson, approached her. "Colonel Hayes, your tactical assessment was invaluable. If you're willing, I'd like you to remain on the planning team through execution." "Of course," Sarah said without hesitation. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah worked alongside the planning team while continuing to run her training program. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. She was back in the game, using her skills for the purpose they'd been honed for. The rescue operation launched on a moonless night in late March. Sarah sat in the operations center, watching the feeds from helmet cameras and drones as the assault team moved into position. Her heart pounded as she watched them breach the compound, as the first shots were fired, as the team secured the hostages and began the extraction. When the lead element radioed "package secure, exfil in progress," the operations center erupted in quiet cheers. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. 6 American contractors were coming home because of careful planning and brave execution. She had played a small part in that, and it felt like redemption. Colonel Peterson found her after the debriefing. "We couldn't have done this without you, ma'am. Your operational planning was brilliant." "I'm just glad everyone made it out," Sarah said. "Winter Siren," Peterson said quietly, using her old call sign. "The legend lives on." Sarah smiled. "The legend is retired, Colonel, but the person behind it is still here, still serving, still fighting to make a difference." As spring turned to summer, Sarah's program continued to grow and evolve. The first class graduated with honors, and many of them went on to distinguished positions in various special operations units. The female lieutenant from the front row, whose name was Jennifer Martinez, received orders to join a classified task force. She stopped by Sarah's office before she left. "I just wanted to say thank you, ma'am," Martinez said. "Before this program, I was starting to think I'd never break through certain barriers, that my gender would always be a limitation, but you showed me that excellence speaks for itself." Sarah stood and shook the young officer's hand. "You showed yourself that, Lieutenant. I just provided the opportunity. What you did with it was all you." After Martinez left, Sarah sat back down at her desk and pulled out a piece of paper. She had been working on a proposal for General Hawthorne, a plan to expand the tactical program into a full leadership academy. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious, but she had learned that sometimes the boldest moves were the right ones. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. "Mom, I got into medical school, Columbia." Sarah felt her heart swell with pride. Her daughter following her own path, chasing her own excellence. She typed back, "I'm so proud of you. We'll celebrate this weekend." As she set down her phone, Sarah looked around her office. The walls were decorated now with photos from the training program, letters of commendation from students, and a framed copy of the citation that had accompanied one of her silver stars. In the corner stood an American flag that had flown over the base on the day her program officially launched. This wasn't the career she had planned. She had thought her service was over, that her best days were behind her. But she had been wrong. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with perseverance, dignity, and the refusal to accept other people's limitations. Sarah Hayes had been Winter Siren, a ghost in the shadows, a legend whispered in classified briefings. But now she was something more. She was a teacher, a mentor, a leader who was shaping the future of special operations one student at a time. And that, she thought as she returned to her proposal, was a legacy worth fighting for. The sun was setting over Fort Bragg, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Sarah could hear the distant sounds of soldiers running drills, of instructors shouting cadences, of the ongoing work of military life. It was the sound of service, of dedication, of sacrifice. It was the sound of home. And Sarah Hayes, Lieutenant Colonel, retired Special Operations Officer, Winter Siren, was exactly where she was supposed to be.